guys, for those of you who came to our September lectures at QUT, this is basically a video recap that will be designed to complement the slides that are up on the ATAR Notes website. For those of you who didn't come, this video will basically condense down all the important stuff we covered for English. So yeah, let's get started with a quick synopsis of what you can expect here. So I'm just going to break down mostly semester 1 of Year 12 English, Units 3 and 4 of English, with a particular emphasis on Topic 1 and Topic 2. So that's a semi-creative analytical essay, or comparative essay, and then a persuasive oral presentation. And then there'll be a couple of just general tips scattered throughout. But to get started, we're going to look at what English 3-4 is all about and what the course overview is. Also, for those of you who haven't checked them out, if you go to the ATAR Notes website, under the Notes section, you'll be able to download copies of these lecture slides, and that will have a couple of slides that I've just cut out of here for time, and a bit more detail about some of these assessment tasks. So, let's get started. Unit 3, which is what you'll probably have started on already in class, is all about textual connections. The first IA, internal assessment, worth 25% of your overall mark, and that is a written response for a public audience. I'll get into what that means in more detail later. The second assessment is a persuasive spoken response. Unfortunately, for anyone who hates giving oral presentations, that's also a quarter of the mark. Then in Unit 4, you start your close study of literary texts. So even though you're analysing texts all throughout your Year 12 studies, this is where you start really delving into texts in detail and talking about their structural features, literary devices, using a lot of meta language. So you start with an imaginative response, again, 25%, and again, if you are someone who doesn't really like creative writing, unfortunately this is just part of the balance that makes up Unit 3 and 4 overall, but there are plenty of ways where you can approach the task and still manage to, if not cobble together, then at least basically craft a response that might not be the next great Shakespearean work of literature, but hits the criteria. That's what the assessors care about. You don't have to be the next great author to do well in this task. It's all about ticking those boxes that the markers are looking for. Finally, you have your exam at the end of the year. Another quarter of the mark, so it's a pretty balanced curriculum overall. This is an exam that's sat under exam conditions, test conditions. You'll have unseen prompts or essay questions, completely unseen material. Everyone in the state has the same prompts, just for the different texts that they're studying. And everyone's in the same boat. If you get a difficult prompt for your text that year, everyone else who's writing on that text is dealing with the same kind of difficulty. So there's a whole lot of stuff you can do to prepare. We'll be talking about that much later on in the year, but suffice it to say that if you're scared about the exam now, don't be. I'd actually argue this is one of the easiest assessment tasks. It's a fairly basic essay, and you don't have to worry about like imaginative elements or persuasive elements. But yeah, plenty more on that later. Looking at this overview, you could be forgiven for thinking the English curriculum's a little bit split, in that it seems like each quarter of these assessment tasks is kind of dealing with entirely different sets of skills. You're writing for the public, but then you're doing persuasive writing, then you're doing imaginative writing, and it feels a little bit all over the place. However, there are some underlying fundamental skill sets, which, as soon as you get those right, doing well in any of these 4 writing tasks, and indeed any writing tasks across QCE or even university, becomes a lot easier. So, I've just broken this into a little pizza pie chart. Let's talk about those skill sets. How does the curriculum actually gel together? What can you do now and what can you do in your writing to help you get marks regardless of which essay task you're doing or which assessment task you're working on? For starters, a couple of different elements of the comparing texts internal assessment that trickle into all of these others. So the core of this comparing texts assessment tasks is that you are talking about the connections between 2 of the texts that you're studying. They might be adaptations, they might be works that just deal with similar themes, again more on that later, but the core is that you are talking about these connections. This is something that's unique to this area of study, this internal assessment. You never have to talk about connections between 2 texts in your exam or in your creative piece. That's just for this topic. So yeah, there is this one core skill set or practice that you have to do once, get it over and done with. You don't have to worry about it for the rest of the year. However, you are also, as part of this assessment task, practicing making an argument. You have to have a contention about what kinds of connections there are in those two texts. What are the similarities? What are the differences? You have to write for a specific audience. We'll talk about that soon, but you have to target and position your piece in a certain way. You have to understand authorial intention. That's one of the most important phrases in English. What does the author mean, and how can we tell? You don't have to be definitive about this. Obviously, we never know what Shakespeare or Austen or whoever really meant by the text. Thousands of people have spent thousands of years pouring effort into PhDs to tease that apart. Your job is just to come up with justifiable possibilities. Maybe this text is exploring the importance of family in aiding people through times of trial, or maybe it's about the necessity for balance as opposed to extremes. You can find all sorts of language and all sorts of clever ways of phrasing contentions that don't have to come across as incredibly high modal, incredibly definitive. But again, yeah, we'll get into that soon. Suffice it to say that authorial intention is something you should always be thinking about. The author should be at the forefront of your mind, arguably even more so than the text sometimes. Think about what they mean, because that's a surefire way to avoid just retelling the plot and summarizing the characters and the story. It'll force you to start thinking about ideas and the bigger picture. You also have to craft a written piece, as opposed to the persuasive oral, where you are delivering either a video presentation or, more commonly, a speech. This kind of overlaps with the creative piece in that you are crafting something on a piece of paper, and you have to think about and draft and revise and get your teacher's feedback to put together a written composition. And finally, you are analysing textual features. Again, much like authorial intention, this is something that will come up again and again and again. If you can take a piece of writing, an article, a passage of a text, an excerpt from whatever novel, play, poetry, whatever you're studying, and analyse its features. Again, we will discuss what those features consist of exactly in a sec. If you can do that, if you can analyse language on a really fundamental basic level, you can easily do well in English. That's probably the most basic skill set, being able to look at words and think about how they create meaning. If you're not sure where to start there. So, as you can see, in this comparing text area of study, there are all these different skill sets that combine to form part of your overall approach. This is what the assessors are testing. And so if you can do all these things, you're more likely to get higher scores in that area of study. Again, persuasive speech, there's this one that I've underlined here. This is unique to just the persuasive speech. You never have to deliver a speech in any of these other assessment tasks throughout the year. Again, it kind of sucks. I was the kind of student that did not like to give oral presentations in year 12, but I still had to do this too. Just get this out of the way. And again, there are a lot of techniques you can do to just make sure you get through the speech without stuttering and fumbling and dropping your cue cards too much. Within that speech, though, you're considering points of similarity and difference. You're weighing up different arguments. You're looking at the for and against and the for different reasons or against for different reasons. And you're comparing the ideas and presentations. You are looking at the portrayals of different ideas in the media. You've probably done a lot of that in Units 1 and 2 already. And then crafting your own response. You are the author here. So you are demonstrating your understanding of authorial intention by being the author, by creating your own persuasive argument and trying to make the audience think or feel or believe something. Again, you're crafting a written piece, although you are delivering it in a different medium. So some teachers might require you to submit a written copy of your speech too, but what you are marked on predominantly is your oral presentation and how you've effectively delivered it. And as always, analysing textual features. So basically, think about the underlying ideas. Think about the underlying analytical skills that you're working on throughout the year. Don't get too caught up in, oh, what's my next internal assessment task? Because yes, that's important. Yes, everything's a quarter of your mark and you should be thinking about that consistently. But think about your own more, basically think about how your abilities are developing. Do you feel like you're more confident when talking about authorial intention? Do you have more like verbs at your disposal to describe what the author is suggesting and highlighting and condoning and emphasizing? Do you feel like when you craft written pieces, your sense of timing, your ability to put ideas into words, do you feel like that's improving? If not, work on those individual skill sets. It seems like a more roundabout way of studying for English, but it is often a lot more effective than just thinking, how do I go from a C to a B for my next assessment task? Okay, let's talk about topic 1, the actual assessment task itself. So, a written response for a public audience that is comparing two texts. There are two different options here. Your school will only pick one. I'm going to explain both just so you know what the possibilities are. But yeah, don't stress about understanding both. Your school will nominate the text that you study for this internal assessment. You can either get one text and one adaptation. So this would be something like Hamlet, the Shakespeare play, and The Lion King, which is very loosely an adaptation of Hamlet, albeit with more lions and jungle creatures. But yeah, the underlying story of a child and like an evil, sinister uncle who betrays and kills the father, and then this is the protagonist, that's the same across both texts. And The Lion King takes a lot of thematic and plot-related themes from Hamlet as source material. So you could get a really clear adaptation. You might even get something that's even more obvious, like Hamlet and a performance of Hamlet, like a video recording of a performance at the Globe Theatre or something. So this is like obviously a really, really clear link where a lot of the plot, character arcs, all that kind of stuff is going to be very similar. Alternatively, you can get two texts about the same ideas. This might seem a little bit more indirect, but it's basically something like Harry Potter and Narnia. These texts aren't based on one another, but they are about similar concepts, not just magic and a mythical wonderland, but the idea of childhood and going from innocence to experience, discovering new things, loyalty, friendship, all that kind of stuff. So while the plots, they have some similarities, like a child is in a cupboard and he discovers some things, but the ideas is what we're focusing on, the thematic concerns about good versus evil, about the extent to which you can rely on others, about following your own ambitions and trusting one another, that kind of stuff. So those underlying thematic concerns, they're going to be a focus here as well, but this is where you'll need to maybe do some more work in finding them and articulating what are the similarities and differences between these two texts. A couple of things to be cautious of. When comparing texts, your role is not to make judgments about which one is better and to say, Harry Potter does these things, but it's a bit shit, it doesn't really flesh out the themes very well. Narnia, on the other hand, does a really great job at this. That's not the point. You're not a reviewer, you're not passing judgments, you're not evaluating and ascribing value to each text, and you're also not oversimplifying and saying, Hamlet's like a bit boring because it's written in Shakespearean English and no one really cares, but like Lion King's a really great movie and it's like, you have to acknowledge both texts' complexity. Even if you're studying one text that you don't like, even if you're studying two texts that you don't like, you have to read more into them. And you have to assume that both texts have merit and just discuss how or why. That's where you can be more opinionated and more evaluative in forming judgments about where the meaning of the text comes from, how certain language features and structural features contribute to those ideas. You also have to be careful not to spend too much time on one text. The assessors aren't going to literally take out a ruler and say like, only 40% of your time was spent on text A. That's not acceptable. But typically a ratio of 60-40 is going to be completely fine. If your ratio is something more like 80-20, where 80% of your time is being spent on one text and you only spend, half a paragraph talking about the other, that's where the assessors are more likely to look at that and say, do you really understand this text, or have you just skimmed over it because you spent more time on this one in class and you didn't really understand the point of the task? Aim for roughly 50-50, but something like that would be totally fine. Ideally, you'll find not an essay necessarily, but a writing structure, as we'll talk about in a second. This piece doesn't have to be an essay. You will find a structure of writing that lets you talk about the text equally, so you don't even have to worry about it. You'll find a structure that forces you to jump between and draw connections as you go. Having said that, you don't have to just focus on the connections. You are also analysing the text and explaining similarities and differences. So what you don't want is an essay or a piece of writing that starts with one text and then jumps to the other and then goes back and forth and back and forth and back and forth and never really sticks with one text long enough to make a point. If every single sentence is flipping back and forth, it's going to feel really erratic and hard to follow. Instead, you want to spend a few sentences on one text and flesh out one idea, find a connection, flesh out another idea, and then go back again. That's going to be much more readable and legible for your marker to be able to see the progression of your ideas and how well you understand things. And it's probably going to be easier to write because you don't have to constantly be finding links. You can spend a bit of time. You can spend maybe 5 or 6 sentences just talking about how this theme is presented in Hamlet, and then say, similarly, its adaptation, The Lion King, also explores very similar concerns, blah, 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 and then analyse that second text in more detail. Now, let's talk about what the texts consist of. This next slide is probably the most important part of this entire video, I'd say. If you are told to analyze a text, it can be hard to know where to start, and you'll probably just pick open a random page, start talking about some quotes, some characters. Maybe you'll have an idea like, oh, this character is very loyal, and then you have to go back to the text and find evidence to justify it. What I'm going to give you, this whole pyramid structure, is a different way of thinking about text that forces you to be more holistic and sophisticated. So, this is what I call layers of text. Basically, all text can be divided into these different categories. Level 1 is the most basic and the most fundamental. This is where you are talking about structural features, aka most typically quotes, and meta language in general, which I'll come back to in a second. But this is the fundamentals of what a text consists of, literally the language that's on the page. You can zoom in really close and look at single words and connotations, which I really love looking at, which are the thoughts or feelings and associations that come to mind when you say particular words. So you can think about the word choice, which is a way of analysing authorial intention, why would the author have chosen that specific word in this moment? And other literary features and structural devices. So if you're doing a film as your adaptation or your second text for this task, then you can think about the diegetic sound and the camera angles, the mise-en-scene, all the fancy filmic devices, or dramatic devices for plays, poetic devices for poems, all that good stuff. This is analysing the core of the text and the constituents of the text. The next layer up, you have all of these things that contribute to a sense of who the characters are. How do we know that Ron is a loyal character, supposedly in Harry Potter? Well, it's because of the things that he says, and the quotes, and the character arcs, and the structural devices that Rowling chooses. So, you use these structural features to talk about who the characters are, why they are. We'll get into more detail in a second, but structural features create a sense of the identities in the text, who are the characters. These characters give us a sense of what the themes are. How do we know that good triumphs over evil? Oh, well, it's because of what these characters do and what is established throughout the novel, play, film, whatever. And from these themes, we get the top of the pyramid. So this is where we're zooming out and considering the whole text. Rather than just a single quote on this level, we're looking at some big overarching idea up here. V and V means views and values. This is the author's views or values, or the audience's views or values. So how do we respond to the text, and what do we think is important? More commonly, it's what is the author communicating to us as the audience. Ideally, you will and should be comparing across all 4 levels. How do the views and values of text A and B differ? What are those 2 authors communicating? How do the characters differ? How do the themes differ? How do the structural features differ? What is similar and what is different on all 4 of these levels? If you can do at least one over the course of your whole written piece, at least one of everything, you'll be showing a really multi-layered approach to writing your pieces, and you'll be showing your marker that, hey, I understand that texts are made up of structural features, they're made up of characters and identities and personas, they're made up of thematic concerns, and they are made up of, or they will contribute to, this overall idea of views and values. What does the text mean? And what is the text trying to say? What is it trying to communicate to its readers or its audience? Okay, let's unpack each of these levels in a bit more detail. Structural features are the language fundamentals of the text. So quotes, literary devices, connotations, even things like the genre. So how has the text been composed and how is it sort of laid out on the page? Again, you want to talk about meta language to describe these features. If you haven't heard this term before, it's basically language that describes language. I'll have some examples of that on the next slide. And you can do things called close analysis exercises where you are really, really delving into and closely examining single words and single phrases and unpacking their meaning and saying this is how and why the author has chosen to communicate these things. The basic question you're trying to answer here is, how does language create meaning? This might seem either very broad or very specific to you, but once you get practice in weaving this into your writing, it will become a lot more natural. And again, once you know how to do this, a lot of different writing tasks in English and elsewhere become more straightforward. Here's an example of a comparative analysis that is talking about structural features. I'm just using basic like A and B text names here instead of specific examples. On the one hand, author A extols the beauty of the Australian landscape over the course of the novel through descriptive similes, meta language, as vast as the glorious cosmos. By contrast, so we have some comparative language here, the director of text B instead conveys this magnitude visually through his use of long, slow panning shots of the desert environment. So we are comparing the way these two texts, a novel and a film, have portrayed the idea that Australia is very big and empty. One, a novel, uses descriptive similes because it's a novel. A novel can't use camera shots. A novel has to do things using the written word and a lot of literary features. On the other hand, a film, with a director, conveys things visually because it's a film. A film can't stop and just have a narrator spout off a 300-word introduction to a chapter. A film sets up the scene visually by having slow panning camera shots across a very empty, vast space. So that's basically, without yet considering the more specific details of this assessment task, I'll go through examples of what like an actual piece would look like. This is kind of just isolated analysis. But fundamentally, this is what you're aiming to do, right? Essentially, you are comparing one text to another, using references to these structural features and using meta-language to help you do so. So, meta-language, language that describes language. If you haven't looked at this directly in class before, you will have looked at it indirectly, and this is something that all teachers will expect of you in your writing pieces. There are a couple of different categories of meta-language. A really easy one that you will hopefully have heard of, literary devices, so things like symbols, metaphors. There are some more complicated examples, rhetorical devices. These are more for persuasive tasks, but they can be a bit more complex. You can literally look at parts of speech. So why would the author use a particular adjective or lots of conjunctions or something? Grammatical terms, so you can talk about how long sentences are and how grammatical they are, how cohesive or how certain the piece seems, the section of writing, and genre-specific stuff. So films, plays, poetry, all that kind of thing. Why does this matter? Why do you have to use these fancy words instead of just any old basic English? Essentially, meta-language is like English jargon, and it proves that you know what you are doing. If you use meta-language, it shows that you understand the point of the text. Yeah, you can demonstrate it other ways, but meta-language is like your shortcut. It tells the assessors that you understand the core components of English and the text that you are studying, and it's similar to the way they mark your pieces. They look for this understanding, and if you can use that and demonstrate that understanding verbally and through your word choice, it just gives you it's a shortcut. It's a quick pathway to your assessor's brain to say, I know what I'm doing and I understand what this text is all about. So, again, you don't have to memorize a huge chunk. This is by no means a conclusive list, and not all of these will be relevant. You won't come across some of these in the text that you're doing, but you should be familiar with the ones that you notice coming up again and again. Don't go out and memorize a list of every single meta-language word that exists, because that's kind of an infinite list. Any word can describe a word in certain contexts. But do familiarize yourself with some of the basic ones, and if you feel like this is an area where you are lacking, if you feel that writer's block and you often struggle to think of words that describe words, then maybe do some research, come up with some word lists and use that while you're writing to expand your vocabulary. Next, let's talk about characters. So the identities and personalities of the text, obviously. Who are the characters? What are their backstories? What are their thoughts, feelings, beliefs, desires, fears? All of the texts that are chosen for you to study have layers to them. They're not really simplistic, just very basic novels or like fan fiction kind of stuff where characters are really one-dimensional. They are complex. They have layers and they have desires and fears, and you might not know that about all of the secondary or tertiary characters, but typically all of the texts that QCAR and curriculum authorities choose for you to study have these kinds of dimensions to them because they want you to be able to explore them. Another cool thing to talk about is their trajectories. So this is basically like a character arc. Trajectory is a physics-y term, not my area of expertise, but it's basically the journey something takes from A to B. So what kind of trajectory do your characters take? Do they have like an upwards and then a downward arc? Do they start really high and then get really low, but then they start to rebuild their life? Maybe their whole life is a real roller coaster over the course of the text, and you can analyze that. So think about the journey that they undergo. An example of this analysis would be something like where Bill is conveyed as text A's hero from the outset. Ben, in text B, let's say, experiences a more drastic shift in his trajectory as audiences observe him gradually coming to terms with the consequences of his actions. So that would be an example of analysing trajectories and talking about the differences in how the characters are portrayed and constructed. Next, themes. Themes are the ideas of a text. What are the texts about? What concepts do the texts explore? Typically, you can condense themes down to single words, and this is a big difference between themes and views and values concerns. A theme would be something like love, family, war, relationships, etc. Basic ideas, you will hopefully have covered these in earlier years of English study as well for different books. For example, both text A and text B explore the importance of landscape and how it influences our sense of personal and national identity. Now, themes and the single word kind of focus of what are the ideas and what is this all about differs from views and values, which are the messages, intentions, and receptions of text. So what's the author trying to communicate? How do the readers or the audience feel? What are we made to think? How are we positioned? And what is the bigger picture? This is where the language I like to use is zooming out. So if you think about that pyramid, if we're talking about structural features on level 1, you need to zoom in, you need to get closer to the text and think more specifically about the evidence and examples you're talking about. Or we talk about zooming out to the idea of views and values. Like, okay, yeah, but what's the point? You've talked about the characters and the plot and you've mentioned some quotes, but zoom out. Think about the author. Use a sentence like, thus the author conveys a sense of blah, blah, blah. And you have to zoom out and think about the overarching concerns. So these would be things about humanity, the world, universal truths. It can sound a little bit pretentious, but just play the game a little bit. Think about the overall intention, authorial intent behind the text. That's where your focus should be. And in contrast to themes, views and values should be more than just a few words. So this should be something like, true leadership is the product of one's core values, or the desire to lead others comes from the circumstances we find ourselves in. So the theme here is leadership, but the views and values concern is, for one text, leadership comes from who we are and what we believe in, and from another text, it's about, it's circumstantial. It's about, greatness is forced upon us in certain circumstances and people just have to rise to the challenge. It's not necessarily about them, it's about where they are and who they're amongst. So, across all 4 of those layers, we're comparing texts in different ways and for different ends. But in all of those sentences, in all of those samples that I've included here, there is lots and lots of comparative language. This is super important for this task. You can't write an essay that just analyzes each text in isolation. You have to be able to use comparative language to jump between them. So, some examples here. I've also included a table in the English notes, the English book, that you can see on ATAR notes for QCE. That has a more specific breakdown of some of these points of comparison. Listed some here, and then there's some other vocabulary tables in that book as well. Okay, now let's talk about the different kinds of comparison. So we've talked about what structural features are, the base of that pyramid, and we've talked about the themes and views and values concerns. Basically, each one of these coloured arrows is a different option for how you analyse, and I'm going to go through each 4. So, the first one, the red arrow, is similarities in structural features. For example, you could say both texts feature blood as a symbol of guilt. We are looking at a structural feature, symbolism, specifically blood and guilt, that is the same in both texts, or at least similar. Then we have similarities in ideas or messages. So this is like a similar theme or a views and values concern. Both texts suggest that seeking vengeance is dangerous. Okay, that's a message that's consistent across 2 texts. Then we have differences in structural features. So one text uses stage directions, because it's a play, to show what the other one does visually, because it's a film or a documentary or a performance. Finally, differences in ideas or message. So the texts differ in their portrayal of whether violence is ever justified. Having gone through that general overview, basically, hopefully that makes sense. You're either comparing whether something is the same or different, and what you are analysing is either a structural feature that's really close to the text, or it's a bigger picture idea or message, theme and views and values concerned. So, now that we have these colours in mind, let's do a bit of Bob Ross colour mixing and make some happy little trees. There are 2 different types of colour mixing we're going to do. First one is combining red and purple, so discussing how the same structural feature can create different ideas or messages. For example, In Harry Potter, the cupboard under the stairs is used as a symbol to represent limitations of Harry's life with the Dursley. By contrast, C.S. Lewis's Narnia also features a symbolic wardrobe, but here it's instead used as a portal to a magical world of possibilities. So, I know this is obviously none of you are studying Harry Potter and Narnia this year, but hopefully that little sample sentence or two makes sense. We are looking at a symbol that is the same in both texts, the symbolism of a wardrobe or a cupboard or a place of confinement, but we're talking about how it's used differently by the authors. In one instance, it is a form of limitation and suppression and child abuse, to be frank, but in the other, it is a portal. It represents a this liminal space that transforms and becomes this magical world. So the same symbol is used to different effects. The reason why I'm suggesting combining them, basically, is if you just point out the same structural feature, you kind of don't have anywhere to go with it. If you're just like, oh, both Harry Potter and Narnia have a wardrobe. Okay, yeah, cool, but what's the point of that? What are the authors doing? Combining that with blue, different ideas or messages, forces you to analyze and say, okay, why would the authors use this differently? And it shows this really cool understanding of how texts work, which is you can take the same symbol, but you can say different things with it. That's also more effective than just saying the same structural feature conveys the same idea or message. Like, oh, in Harry Potter, the candle is a symbol for light. Furthermore, in Narnia, the candle is a symbol for light. That doesn't really get us anywhere either. So, the flip side to that is combining the two leftovers, yellow and green, which makes, I don't know, a limey colour, let's say. This is where you discuss different structural features, but ones that have the same effect in terms of ideas or messages. This is really easy to do when you're talking about different genres, because a novel and a film will, by their very nature, have different structural features, but often, especially if they're adaptations, they're communicating the same basic thing. For example, Hamlet's psychological turmoil is evident in his fractured dialogue, including his references to himself in the third person, again, really specific meta-language that talks about the language that we're seeing here, as if Hamlet be from himself taken away. Similarly, The Lion King also conveys Simba's frustrations and anguish following the death of his father, though the film does this through the use of song, and then we go on to analyse whatever sad song plays in the movie at that point. So, same effect. These two characters, Hamlet and Simba, are sad about their fathers dying, but different structural features, because the exigencies of genre prohibit each text from doing the opposite. The play, Hamlet, can't just break out into a Disney remix, and the film can't really just have a bunch of fractured speech, because it would be weird for Simba to just break out into a soliloquy. So, keep this colour mixing stuff in mind. When we get into more detail about the task in a second, it's easy to lose sight of how to actually analyse the text. So this is a semi-abstract means of understanding what your piece should be accomplishing. Now we can look at how to actually accomplish it and what this task is all about. If you haven't already, I'd highly recommend checking out the syllabus on the QCAL website. Your teachers will hopefully go through this with you as well. It is kind of more of a tool for teachers than students. There's some stuff you don't have to worry about as much in there, but there are some really, really useful sections where the syllabus straight up tells you this is what you need to do. You write I've probably accidentally referred to it as an essay, but no, for this task, IA1 is not an essay, it is a media text, such as an article, essay, blog, or column, so for either an online or print publication, other stipulations. And we'll go through the task criteria in a bit more detail in a sec, but essentially you shouldn't think of this as your stock standard essay that you write for your English teacher. This is a media text written for a media audience. So you have to be a little bit creative and adopt a persona and kind of construct a piece here. So, firstly, try to pick something you're familiar with. Your teacher might give you some recommendations like, oh, write for a literary magazine. If you don't know what a literary magazine is, don't write a literary magazine piece. But hopefully you're listening to this at a point where you have enough time to go back through, or to do your research basically. Go online and look up some literary magazines. And think about how they write and the kind of voice that those authors use and the kind of language and register that they use. So do your research. Look at websites where these kinds of pieces would be published. Conversation is a really good place for sort of general think pieces. Menyon, I'm not quite sure how to say that one, but that's like an Australian literary magazine that kind of looks at ideas in text and links them to the real world, which is a great starting point. even just like newspaper websites and their books sections. These are probably more like reviews than articles or essays, but you can get a bit of both sometimes. The reason why I'm recommending research is because you have to be wary of verisimilitude, which is a fancy word for believability. How believable is your piece? Your piece has to seem like it could really be published on The Conversation or on the Guardian website or some kind of, even if it's just a made-up publication, you have to have some kind of essence to your piece that makes it feel real. It can't read like a Year 12 essay pretending to, or a Year 12 student pretending to be a literary journalist. It has to feel real, which means you have to emulate the kinds of features that those pieces have. Your piece has to be a believable essay or blog or column or whatever it is you're writing. Ultimately, you are still trying to hit the criteria, though. You can't just copy and paste an essay from some online literary journal, because this is still a piece that's written for the QCE English syllabus, and you have to be ticking those boxes. But you kind of hide it with this layer of how it's presented, and that's worth marks too. So here is an example of what not to do. Let's say I'm pretending to write a piece for the Courier Mail, and I title it Comparing Harry Potter and the Chronicles of Narnia. First of all, this is not a newspaper title. No newspaper has ever published something like this. This is not how newspaper titles work, right? This sounds like the title of a student's essay. This sounds like the file name of the Word doc you send your teacher at 11:30 p.m. when you forget to submit something. This is not the kind of ready for publication, believable assessment task that your teachers want to see. Similarly, the very first line, there are many similar themes in J.K. Rowling's Harry Potter series and the Chronicles of Narnia. No. People don't write like that in the real world. You write like that in English essays. You don't write like that if you are pretending to be a journalist or a literary critic or a reviewer. Both texts explore the importance of blah, blah, blah. Okay, cool. Like, this is going to hit the criteria because it's giving us a clear sense of the similar themes between these texts. But what it's not doing is being a believable piece of writing, a media text. And even though it's talking about these similarities and differences, it's really not effective in kind of masking it with this layer of believability and a crafted written piece. On the flip side, let's look at this example. Why I Still Read Children's Stories. Instantly, way better headline, right? We don't necessarily know which text we're going to be comparing, but this is the kind of piece you could imagine being, or this is the kind of title rather, that you can imagine appearing in a newspaper article. It's got that, not quite clickbaity, but that like hook that reels the readers in and is, oh, okay, why do you still read children's stories? Let's discover. And we have a like pretend persona here. This isn't a requirement, but it can help lend credence to the believability of your piece for reasons we'll get into. My youngest granddaughter had her 11th birthday this week. For a decade, I've relished spoiling her with special editions of the same children's book that I gave her siblings and cousins on their birthdays. Harry Potter, The Chronicles of Narnia. Okay, cool, so these are the texts we're going to be looking at. And anything else with a hint of magic. But this year, just as young Harry was whisked away to a new world on his 11th birthday, so too has my granddaughter been drawn in by other, more mature presents, a smartphone, a MacBook, a smartwatch that's also a smartphone. I know this is just the inevitable passing of time, but I can't help but long for the days of settling down to read a chapter in the lives of Harry or Lucy with my family. This is setting the scene for what is going to go on to be a more analytical piece that looks at these two texts, but it is doing it in a far more believable way. You can imagine this being published on a website or a newspaper article somewhere, and you get a sense of who Martha Rylan is. I've just made her up, but we have a picture of this woman who is devoted to her family, and she's sitting in a rocking chair being like, oh, the bloody smartwatches these days and the kids and blah, right? We have a sense of who she is and why she is writing this piece. This author has a sense of purpose. Why is she writing this piece? Because she's sad that this kind of lost art or lost tradition and practice of sitting down to read about these children's lives is being lost because the younger generation is all about the Apple these days, am I right? So she's talking about this kind of shift in the passage of time, and that gives the piece a sense of credence, and it makes you feel like it's real. This piece, on the other hand, why is this person writing this essay? I don't know, probably because they have to do it for an assignment and for their Year 12 assessment task. This doesn't sound like a real author who is evaluating these texts for a reason. So think about what your purpose is. Maybe it's something that's happened in the real world that has triggered you to write about something in your personal life. Maybe something has happened politically, geopolitically, that is forcing you to reevaluate something that you once thought you knew. Maybe something in the text is happening that you can draw parallels with to the real world, again, culturally, economically, whatever you want to focus on. If you don't know what kind of piece to write, look to the syllabus. I think this is, I forget which page this is on, but if you Control F any of these phrases, the syllabus has this really long list. I've only included an excerpt of it, but they have a bunch of different suggestions. Like, you can write a piece that looks at the role of the anti-hero in critiquing societal attitudes. Or you can look at the power of a post-colonial text to question current cultural assumptions. Obviously not all of these will work for the particular text combination that you've got for this area of study, but it's a really, really good starting point. I think it's page 30 or so of the syllabus. There's a bunch more here, and they do similar things for all the different areas of study. So yeah, check the syllabus. It is a highly useful document with a bunch of suggestions that can help get you started. Now I'm just going to run through a quick little checklist to make sure your piece has verisimilitude and it is sufficiently believable for your assessor. Who am I? Who is authoring this piece? So we'll do the, who, what, when, where, why. What genre am I writing in? What kind of piece is this? What tone and language style should I be using? When am I writing this? What's happened that's prompted it? Where is this piece appearing? So what publication, print, online, who's it being distributed to? And most importantly, why am I writing this? What is my purpose? And what is the point? Not, oh, I'm going to get a good mark in English this year and make sure my teacher likes me, but what's Martha's reason for writing? Why is Martha, what's her name, sitting there in a rocking chair, dictating this to be published in whatever publication you can come up with? So, find a purpose, construct a purpose, put time and effort into this in the same way you would analysing the text and thinking about what to write, because this is the overall kind of shell that your piece will be presented in, and it's really important that that shell is impressive and it does a good job at pretending what you want it to be. Your argument is what you're analysing and what you're actually communicating about the text. So that's you as a Year 12 student talking to your teacher saying, here are my ideas, but that should all be wrapped up in your purpose, which is you pretending to be a literary critic who's been tasked with analysing whether this Shakespearean play is still relevant to the modern age, and you're doing that by looking at a modern adaptation of it. So, keep in mind those two differences and think about the textual pyramid and how you can link all four of those layers to these ideas as you are writing. If your piece has verisimilitude and you are talking about all four of those layers, then you'll be fine for this assessment task. Cool. Next, we're going to talk about the second topic, which is the persuasive oral presentation. I'll go through this one a little bit quicker, and in subsequent lecture series we'll go into more detail with this. Basically, you have to choose an issue that's been in the media for the past 12 months. Your school might also select one for you, but typically they'll give you the choice. Try to pick something that is complex but manageable. Don't go for something super basic like burning school uniforms, because the teachers have heard it all before in grade 6. They don't want to hear it again in year 12. And honestly, it'll be hard to write because you have to write something that's complex. And if you pick a really straightforward topic, you're not really giving yourself much room to move. Also, don't try and pick anything that's super one-sided, like, hi, my name is Lauren, I am going to talk about why terrorism is bad, because no one's arguing against that. And you can't construct good arguments to obviously correct statements. I guess you can, but it's not going to be interesting. And your teacher might even genuinely penalise you for it, because you haven't chosen an issue that is layered, that is, a perspective through reasoned argument to persuade an audience. You can't really persuade an audience of something they already agree with, and so it's going to be a lot harder to craft something impressive. But make sure it's manageable. Don't pick something like the growing risk of war with Iran in the wake of the attack on Saudi Arabia's oil infrastructure. If you feel like you can write a persuasive piece about this and cover it in a 5 to 8 minute oral presentation, good luck to you. Maybe there are a few of you who can do this impressively. This is probably too risky though. All of these options just come laden with so many problems that it's not worth trying. Pick something nuanced, complex, but within both your skill set and knowledge sense, manageable, and in the time constraints. This is still an assessment task. You don't get bonus points for picking something that's needlessly complicated. Once you have an issue, once you have ideally something that you're really passionate about, if you're interested in science or economics and commerce or social issues or the environment, pick something that speaks to you and that you care about, because it will be much more interesting to talk about for you. Then you can start to construct your contention or your argument, but not a shouty argument, a flower argument. The way I like to think of this is your contention is like the core of a flower, and all of your arguments stem from this flower and return to this flower. So you have a sub-argument, a supporting argument for your contention, that's based on your contention, but it goes out and explores other ideas, and then it comes back to your contention to reinforce your point. And you do that consistently throughout your speech to make your argument stronger and stronger. So, make sure your contention has some complexity too. Don't do something like, we should stop domestic violence, because again, no one's going to be realistically, hopefully, disagreeing with that, and it's not going to be particularly impactful. On the flip side, don't be directionless, and don't basically give a contention that doesn't make your audience want to do something. You have to give them a sense of direction. This was actually one of the contentions that someone in my year level chose, and he just got up and delivered a speech that was like, yeah, it's too late to do anything about climate change. Even if we stopped all greenhouse production, gas production tomorrow, everyone's dead, all the polar bears are going to die, it's too late. And then he sat down, and we're like, oh, that's a bit sad. We didn't have, like, it wasn't really persuasive, because we were sitting there being like, I guess I feel emotions as a result of that speech, but I don't really believe anything more. I don't want to do anything. You just kind of said some really sad, depressing facts. And it wasn't impactful, and that student didn't do well because it wasn't a persuasive speech. Yes, he had an argument, but it was a directionless argument. So make sure you have something that you can, craft a call to action at the end and say, rise up, we have to do something about this. We have to, whatever the action might be, you have to have an action. You have to have a driving force behind your speech. And finally, don't think that you can choose a contention that's wacky and different and get bonus points for it. Teachers don't want to see something unique in that sense, and so you shouldn't be picking contentions that are like, oh, hey guys, I've got something, crafty and different to say, here's my take on this issue. Pick something you genuinely agree with, which hopefully is not this. A good way of crafting these kinds of contentions is to use what I call the problem to solution method. This is also in the English notes in more detail, but spend the first, give or take, roughly a third of your speech describing why the problem is so bad. This is, essentially it's designed to make the audience think and feel that the issue is incredibly serious, because that's persuasive. If they think something's a really big problem, they're going to be wanting a solution for it. Then the second third of your speech is about how your solution would solve the problem. So you start off by saying, oh my god, this is so terrible, and humanity has been wrestling with this for decades, and no one's come up with a solution, and if we don't, everything's going to burn and be horrible, and oh my god, what do we do? Here's my answer. And the second part of your speech starts delving into, this is how we're going to address every single one of these problems and concerns. And then the last third is why your solution is the best one, so you can compare it to other similar or related suggestions or solutions that have been put forth, and ultimately rest on the, no, my contention is best, and this is why my solution is going to solve all the problems, and you have your final call to action and your hopefully optimistic end to your speech. Even if you're dealing with an issue that is really serious and dark and maybe personal to you, or something that seems insurmountable or too complex to be solved by anything basic. Even if you're picking something really complex like climate change or the refugee crisis, you're not expected to solve it in your 6-minute English presentation, but you are expected to deliver something impactful by the end and take your audience on this journey where they end up thinking and feeling and believing something really strongly at the other side of it. To do that, there are 3 different types of persuasion I'm going to cover. The first one is pathos, which P for passion and emotion. This is about appealing to the audience's feelings and their emotional states. So typically this will be about eliciting sympathy, so you might tell a really sad story about someone who was affected by this issue to open your speech, or you might galvanize anger or provide inspiration and basically manipulate / persuade your audience to believe and think what you want them to think and feel. So this is about considering the audience's emotional state at any given point and how you want them to be feeling. If you want your audience to feel something, you should ideally feel it when you are speaking. If I want you to be angry, I'm going to sound angry when I'm speaking. If I want you to be sad, I'm going to use this really sympathetic tone and I know this is an audio video, but you can, furl your eyebrows down and make your face sad, because that makes your voice sad and it sounds so much more impactful and evocative. So, think about these emotions, and because basically it'll change your delivery, and you are marked on your delivery. You're marked on this being an oral presentation, so you should be manipulating the emotions of your audience in a particular way using oral presentation skills, like facial expressions, hand gestures, tone of voice, all that kind of stuff. Next, ethos. This is about ethics and credibility, so beliefs, and appealing to the audience's sense of justice and morality, what's right and what's wrong. Pretty much you want to be making them feel like your solution, your problem is unjust and your solution is just. Why is the problem so bad and why is my answer so good? If I can convince you of those two things, I've instantly delivered a very persuasive and powerful speech, because I'm saying, oh my god, this problem is utterly terrible and it's preying upon the innocent and it's this hugely problematic question for society, and my solution, my contention, my proposal is going to address all of these concerns and it's going to do it in the best way possible. So appealing to the kind of the ethical processing and the kind of the justice scales of balance in your brain about what's good and what's bad. And this is based on the notion that people at their core want things that are just and moral and mentally rebel against things that are unjust and immoral. Finally, logic. For some people this is the easiest, some it's the hardest. This is appealing to the audience's rationality and sense of what is reasonable and sensible. So your contention should seem reasonable. If your contention seems unreasonable, it's not persuasive. No one wants to agree with something if the proposal being suggested is something really outlandish or difficult to justify. Whereas if your contention is incredibly logical and reasoned and easy to follow, it's hard to poke holes in. So a really logical argument is typically a persuasive one. So your arguments should be easy to follow, really step by step, and take your audience on a journey. It should be like a train of thought that helps the audience navigate your speech, rather than an essay where you are writing an introduction and then 3 to 4 body paragraphs and then a conclusion. You should think about your speech as a journey, because when you're reading it out, your audience, your teacher and students, can't hear your body paragraphs. They will if you make them super obvious, and you shouldn't, because a speech is more about a flowing progression from start to finish. And you should think of it as this like garden path that you lead your audience down and you journey towards this overall contention that you're trying to communicate. More specifically, along the way you should be doing certain things. You might do this you might do all of this stuff within the first minute of your speech, or you might spend 3 whole minutes on each of your sub-arguments. You can do this in really different ways. But essentially you start with some kind of hook. I will explain what that is in a minute, but basically it's what it sounds like. It's a way of hooking the audience in and making your speech really interesting from the start. Then you delve into some context, background information, tell us what your contention is. Unlike other essays, unlike topic 1, where you kind of have to hide it a bit and you can't just come out and say, oh, the texts explore these similar themes, this is where you can be super, super direct, because that's the point of being persuasive. We shouldn't be getting to the end and being like, oh, that was really sophisticated, I wonder what the argument was. If the audience doesn't know what your argument was, then your speech won't have done its job. So, make your contention clear, delve into your sub-arguments, provide evidence, and go through that process however many times it takes to kind of sufficiently justify your contention and hit the time limit. So, delve into different kinds of sub-arguments and repeat that process, etc., before you get to your final conclusion. So your impactful mic drop moment where you get to the end and say, this is why I believe what I believe, and that's why I think you should too, and you end with a bang, basically. To explain that, the reason for that is the first sort of, let's say 20 seconds to a minute of your speech is where your assessor, your teacher, is deciding, basically that's the first impression that they get. So if your speech is really fumbly and stumbly and you get up and you don't really have anything impactful to say, if you delve straight into background information, that can also get really boring. If you're just informing the audience about stuff, everyone's going to be sitting there like, yeah, whatever. But if you have something interesting from the outset, it's, okay, everyone's sitting up and paying attention, and you've captured our attention and introduced us to this issue in a really interesting way. Your ending is your final last impression. This is where your mark will be decided. So if your assessor is still kind of umming and ahhing about okay, some of your sub-arguments were good, I don't know about that point of evidence, that was a bit weird, but you started off strong and you were doing well all throughout and blah blah blah, should this be an 8 out of 10 or a 9 out of 10, where are you sitting? If you end on a really, really strong note, that can push you up to a 9 or even a 10 out of 10. If your ending is, yep, thank you, goodbye, that was my argument, goodbye, if you end really weakly, if you are just restating something that you've mentioned already, if you don't hit the time limit, that's also a problem, so make sure you are between 5 to 8 minutes. Your teachers will emphasize that, I'm sure. Or if you're going really overtime and then you start rushing and you're talking too fast and you're blah, 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 okay, goodbye. If you're just sprinting through the end of your speech, that's also not particularly impactful, because you're not giving those well-written, well-crafted words that you've put so much time into when writing your speech the chance to have that impression on the audience. So make sure you pace yourself, and make sure you put a lot of thought into both your ending and your beginning. Let's talk about what that beginning can consist of. Your hook is designed to make your introduction really memorable. The way I think of this is, it's the kind of thing that you want your teacher to go back to the staff room after class and be like, oh my god, guys, you wouldn't believe what this student did. Oh, it was so cool. They had this really creative opening. Hopefully in a good way, not a, oh my god, you wouldn't believe what this kid did. But a thing your teacher wants to brag about, like, oh, this was so impressive and creative, and it got a laugh, or it got a cry, or, it had its intended impact, whatever that might have been. For example, you could open with something incredibly emotional. You could tell a really interesting, powerful, provocative story about someone who's been affected by the issue, like I said. You might talk about the either small scale or big scale effects, whatever you think is most impactful. You could open with humour. Be careful about this. You don't want to open with a somewhat risky joke and then get no laughs, because it's not a great way to start off an oral presentation. And also, if your issue is incredibly serious, opening with humour is going to feel really out of place. So that should, if you're talking about something incredibly, that's either not necessarily touchy, like your issues can be controversial, but if you're covering domestic violence and you open with a knock-knock joke, the assessor's going to be like, just sit down, don't do this, right? The kind of hook that you choose should in some way match or mirror or suit your issue. Yes, you might be able to pull it off and you might think you've got the perfect knock-knock joke. Just, think about what would be appropriate for your issue and for your contention. Opening with a story is pretty much always a good option. This might be a real story or a crafted, constructed one, because you might be pretending, much like your first assessment task, you can put on a persona and say, like, as a member of the Australian Federation of Nurses, I'm here to talk to you today about the serious effects of drugs that I see every day in the emergency room, or something. And you can pretend and you can put on this persona and talk about your experiences. Opening with a bookend. This is where you have, basically, like, literally, if you have on a bookshelf a paperweight or something that keeps all the books together, and something that exists at the start and the end of your speech that provides it with this sense of, like, overall cohesion. So this might be, you can kind of do this in combination with anything else. You might tell a story at the start of your speech, and then when you get to the end, you bookend with that same story, and you come back to that idea and say, maybe one day my experiences will no longer be those held by the majority of nurses. Maybe, if you might mention one particular name or a particular statistic and come back and revisit that statistic or symbol or idea or whatever it is at the end of your speech, and that can be a nice, recollection moment when you get to the end. This is a risky one, but this is something that I did in my own speech in Year 12. You can open with confusion, and you can do something that might confuse the audience for a second, because that gets their attention. The example that I go through in my the English notes is, I started my speech just by talking Slovenian for 30 seconds. And then I say, oh, you're probably all quite confused right now. That's because the Australian government has cut funding to language learning in Victorian high schools. And then that was my way into talking about the approach that the federal or state government, I can't remember, the government had towards funding language learning. And, oh, I bet you wouldn't be confused if we had the chance to learn languages just like my grandparents did, and blah, 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 right? That was risky, because I didn't, if I let that go on too long and I spent 2 minutes talking in Slovenian, I'm pretty sure my teacher would have interrupted me and be like, this is an English class, right? But it was also, it ended up being impactful, because the audience, the students, and my teacher had that moment of, oh, okay, I see what you did there. Which, again, if you spend some time constructing it, you can do this really well. But always make sure that it's appropriate for your topic. Don't get up there and start talking Slovenian if you're doing a speech on climate change, And the opposite to that is opening with clarity and saying something that's just super unambiguous and like, here is my argument. because that can also be really attention grabbing. So think about how you can, most appropriately capture your audience's interest and your assessor's interest right from the start. You can also, like I said for bookends, revisit your hook at the end, and that kind of ties the piece together really nicely. Finally, I'm just going to go through some general oral presentation tips. I know a lot of you will have heard similar things before. Some of these might be really straightforward and obvious, but I'll go through some more specific, like QCE English-centric advice here. Body language, think about your hand gestures and your posture and how you're presenting yourself. Use body language to add emphasis to your points. Don't be up the front doing the Mexican wave because you got told to use hand gestures, but add emphasis and use hand punches and point at things. And if you look for examples of persuasive speeches online and actual video recordings of people speaking, you'll notice that they do a lot of hand gestures and gesticulations to draw your attention to particular things. Make eye contact, particularly with your teacher, but even just generally with the room. Don't make eye contact at any friends that are going to make you laugh in your class, but make eye contact and look around the room. If you are a really panicky, anxious, nervous public speaker, just look at furniture and look at the walls. That's kind of sufficient. Again, teachers aren't using a measuring tape and making sure you are directly lining up with people's eyes. It's just about addressing the crowd rather than reading off palm cards. Voice. Make sure you speak slowly. Do as I say, not as I do. I know that I'm a very fast speaker, but when you are delivering an oral presentation, you have to let your words sink in. Because otherwise, if you're just running them together and you're doing really fast, it's hard for your teacher to understand the time and effort you've put into making your speech persuasive. So slow down. You always talk faster than you think you are. And that goes for your timing as well. It's 5 to 8 minutes, but if you're just scraping like 5 minutes or you're barely fitting it into 8 minutes, be aware that when you deliver your speech, you'll probably speak at a different speed because you might be more nervous, or you might have, by that point, you might know it so well that you start racing through it because you have actually memorized the speech. So keep it slow, keep it well paced. Try to vary your tone and your pitch throughout your piece. If you have a section where you just need to provide some information, so you're going through the background information and you're like blah blah blah, and then this happened and then this happened, that doesn't have to be really loud and punchy because you are just briefly informing the audience of something so that you can persuade them of something afterwards. And the persuasion is when you want to be loud and you want to emphasize your points, right? Varying degrees of loudness are, basically this again depends on the issue, and you don't want to make this seem like a shouty, screaming match that 3 classrooms over are like, oh, that's a persuasive argument. Just use this sparingly. It can be a really impactful way to add emphasis to things, basically. Another great way to do this is to use what I call power pauses, which are when you hit moments in your speech and you're building up to this point and your voice sounds like a crescendo and you build up and up and up, and then you make your ultimate point and you just let it sink in. And you pause for a few seconds and you just let the audience come to terms with that. Again, use in moderation, because if you're just pausing for ages, the assessors will cotton on to the fact that you're not, you maybe haven't written enough to get to the 5-8 minute mark. And also don't pause for a super long time, because that's just really awkward. But it's a great way of drawing attention to points. You'll notice that pretty much all of these delivery tips are about emphasis, are about the really powerful moments in your speech you want to draw attention to. Finally, cue cards. Try to avoid writing out your entire speech if you know that you're really anxious and you forget where you are, or if it's a comfort blanket for you, a security blanket, and you think it would make you more confident, go for it. But typically it's best to try and just list kind of bullet points to remind you of where you are, and really important like facts and names and figures that you can't forget. And then memorize your speech separately, but your cue cards on the day should just be like memory tricks, basically, or reminders of what you need to cover, rather than the entire thing, because it's really tempting to just read it out and then you lose marks for your presentation because you're reading out a speech rather than delivering a speech. And you can annotate your cue cards with instructions, so you can have reminders like, okay, here's my speech. If you know that you need to get louder in certain points, then like underline or highlight it. If you know there's a part where you need to look up at the audience, you can literally write extra instructions to yourself, like look up here, slow down here. I had annotated cue cards in year 12 because I knew I was so caught up in my speech that I'd probably forget certain moments where I'm like, oh, I want to do a power pause here, right? You can literally write reminders to yourself like that on your cue card, so that when you're delivering your speech, you know that when you hit those moments, you have to get louder, get softer, make a hand gesture. Again, if you're a naturally good public speaker, you won't need to do this, but this can be super useful for those of you that feel like it's a little bit more challenging to try and present in front of a crowd, basically. Okay, a few more final, just general tips for English. I've mentioned this already, but use the syllabus. Look it up online, just Google like QCE English syllabus and follow the tabs and prompts. Yes, there is a lot of it that is more just for teachers. The marking schemes and some of that stuff is a bit more like pedagogical, but really useful document. And if you're not sure about the task criteria, or if your teacher really hasn't explained it to you, that can be a good starting point. Beyond that, make sure you use your teachers. They're getting all sorts of information from QCAR. Most of them have had years of experience in teaching English. Even if it's not for the ATAR syllabus, they know the basics and they're there to help you. So work with them throughout the year. They are an incredibly useful resource to you. You can also use the ATAR Notes forums. So this is if you have questions for other, like your peers around the state, you want to feel like you want to get a sense for how everyone's going. If you want questions answered, there are people like me on the forums who'll be able to help you with English and all sorts of other subjects. Beyond that, in terms of like what you can do now to help you succeed throughout Year 12, practice the small stuff. Start with things that you know are going to make a really big difference to your marks and your confidence, most importantly. So if you feel like you can't really analyze quotes very well, start there. Just write half a paragraph or like a mini analysis where you take apart some quotes that you understand really well from the text and practice putting them into your sentences and analyzing them really effectively. It doesn't have to be all out, like writing an entire practice essay or a practice task every single time you study for English. You can work on the small stuff. Look over a vocab list, read another high-scoring response, go through and annotate the syllabus. Just do things that you think are going to help you feel more confident in this subject. The best tip I have, ultimately, target your weaknesses and turn them into strengths. Start with what you know you don't know. What is it about English that you find tricky or challenging? Where do you tend to lose marks? What do you find most difficult to understand and accomplish in your writing? Start there. Work small, work targeted, and it'll be much more easier to watch your marks increase over the year and hopefully feel better about English and feel more confident in this subject. So, that's pretty much all for me. Like I said, there's a bit more detail in the slides that will be uploaded on the notes section of the website. And we also have a bunch of other free resources on the ATAR Notes page if you haven't checked them out already. So, yeah, that's all from me. If you have any questions, you can find me on the forums on the English section. I'm always available there if you have English-related or QCE, ATAR questions, anything like that. Yeah, beyond that, I hope to see you at the next lecture series or around the forums, and good luck with English, everybody.